The first indignity of the quarter was meant to be delivered quietly, folded into the crease of a breakfast napkin the way shameful things are folded, so that no one need look at them directly. But Eleanor read every word of it before her tea had gone cold. She did not gasp. She did not push back her chair. She did not give the footman who had carried it in the satisfaction of a reaction to repeat below stairs before the coals were even swept from the grate. Rothmere Hall, in the third spring of her marriage, wore its usual expression of magnificent indifference, its long windows admitting a pale and reluctant light that fell across a breakfast table set for two people who rarely spoke and never touched, its ancestral portraits observing her with the same polite contempt she had learned, by slow and humiliating degrees, to expect from every gilded surface in the house that bore her husband's name, and on paper only, her own. The invoice was brief. It always was. 3 lines in a clerk's careful hand, the sum owed for the quarter's lodging at Rothmere Hall, the interest accrued should payment lapse beyond the fortnight, and at the bottom, in the Duke's own hand, because he insisted on adding this himself, as though the humiliation required his personal signature to be complete, the word that had become, over 3 years, the only name he seemed willing to give her. Tenant, not wife, not duchess, not even, on her most hopeful days, a guest to be endured, a tenant who happened to sign her correspondence Eleanor Ashbourne and sleep 2 corridors from the man whose house it technically was not, since the deed itself, by an old and bitter irony neither of them mentioned aloud, had passed into her father's keeping the year the Rothmere estate nearly drowned in its own debts, and from her father into hers, so that the arrangement by which she paid rent to live beneath a roof that was legally more hers than his existed, for no reason on earth except that Julian Ashbourne, Duke of Rothmere, required it, and required it to be paid to the penny, and required her never to ask him why. She reached instead for the small tin box that sat, as it always sat, beside her plate, its corners worn soft and pale where 3 generations of hands had carried it, and opened the lid with the same unhurried care she gave to everything she did not wish observed. Inside lay a single silver thimble, dented on one side from a fall down a staircase 40 years before her own birth, and a strip of lace no longer than a handkerchief, begun by a woman who had died before she could finish it, the pattern trailing off mid-stitch into a fringe of loose thread that had never once, in Eleanor's careful keeping, been allowed to unravel further. Her mother's box, her mother's thimble, her mother's voice, worn as smooth as the tin itself from repetition, offering the only inheritance that had ever felt entirely her own. A stitch nobody sees still holds the whole seam. Eleanor, so anyway. She had been perhaps 9 years old the first time she heard it, kneeling on a cottage floor with a torn hem in her lap, and no one to praise the mending once it was done, and she had carried the words through every humiliation since the way another woman might carry scripture, not because they promised reward, but because they made the unseen bearable. She closed the box. She drained the tea, cold as it was, because waste was a small moral failure she permitted herself never to commit, whatever larger failures were committed against her. And she began, as she began every quarter, to calculate exactly how much of her own small income, settled upon her by a father who had believed until his final illness that he was purchasing his only daughter a kind of safety, would be required to satisfy her husband's invoice, and how much would remain for the household expenses that he never troubled to notice she still, faithfully, invisibly, managed. It had not always seemed possible that a marriage contracted to save an estate could curdle into an arrangement so precisely transactional, but 3 years had taught her the shape of it well enough to trace it blind. Her father, Josiah Hartley, had made his fortune in wool and iron, a man of no particular birth and considerable shrewdness, who had watched the old Duke of Rothmere run his ancient house toward ruin with the same helpless fascination other men reserved for a slow shipwreck, and who had, in the last years of his life, extended a loan so large and so quietly structured that it had, in effect, purchased not the estate itself, but the survival of it, and with it, though no one called it this at the time, an understanding. The old Duke's son would marry Josiah Hartley's daughter, and the debt would be forgiven in the marriage settlement, and the Hartley money would flow, discreetly and permanently, into Rothmere's failing arteries. And everyone at the wedding breakfast had called it a triumph of sensible alliance, the kind society applauded precisely because it required no one to admit what it actually was. Julian Ashbourne had been 23 at the time, newly the Duke, his father buried a bare 6 months, and he had stood at the altar with the particular stillness of a man performing a transaction he found beneath him, but could not, in honor or in arithmetic, refuse. He had never once, in 3 years, suggested that Eleanor herself was beneath him. He was far too controlled a man to say a cruel thing so plainly. But he had built, brick by careful brick, an entire architecture of distance designed to ensure that no one, least of all his own wife, ever mistook the marriage for anything warmer than the ledger entry that had produced it, and the rent was merely the most visible timber in that architecture, a monthly reminder rendered in coin that whatever she was to him, she was not, and would never be permitted to become, someone he owed anything softer than payment. She rose from the table at last, tucked the tin box into the pocket of her plain gray morning gown, a garment chosen, as all her garments were chosen, for its total absence of ornament, no lace at throat or wrist, no color beyond the gray and the occasional charitable concession to a darker blue, because a woman who dressed like a tenant, she had decided early, invited fewer questions than a woman who dressed like a duchess and was treated like neither, and made her way toward the estate office where the household accounts waited for her, as they waited every morning in a state of quiet disarray that only she seemed capable of untangling. It was there, an hour later, that Mrs. Pruitt the housekeeper found her, sleeves pinned back, ink on 2 fingers, resolving a dispute between the wine merchant's account and the cellar's actual contents that Mr. Wren the steward had declared, the week before, entirely unsolvable. It was not unsolvable. It required only patience and a willingness to read every figure twice, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent her girlhood balancing her father's mill accounts at a desk too tall for her feet to reach the floor, and within the hour she had found the error, a transposed digit in a June delivery, and corrected it, and written the correction in a hand so neat that Mr. Wren, when he saw it, would only murmur that her ladyship had a gift for figures, as though gifts were things one complimented and then forgot, the way one compliments a well-trained dog for a trick it will never be asked to perform in company. No one saw the hour it had taken her. No one saw the 3 other errors she quietly resolved that same morning, in the tenant rent rolls and the gamekeeper's ledger, and a miscalculated bill from the London tailor that would have cost the estate £11 it did not have to spare. That, too, was familiar. She had learned, in 3 years of marriage to a man who required rent from his own wife, that competence exercised without witness was still competence, whatever the house chose to call it, or fail to call it at all. It was society, and not the account books, that would deliver the second and more public wound of that season, and it arrived, as such wounds so often did, wearing the shape of a party. The Rothmere townhouse in Grosvenor Square had been opened for the first grand evening of the London season, and Eleanor had spent the better part of a week ensuring that the event which bore her husband's name would want for nothing, the musicians engaged, the ices ordered, the guest list balanced with the exquisite tact of a woman who understood precisely which dowagers could not be seated near, which rivals, and she had done all of it, as she did everything, from a room set slightly apart from the rest of the house, her presence in the planning as invisible to the assembled company as her presence in the ledgers. She stood now near the edge of the ballroom, in a gown of unremarkable gray silk, refusing, as she always refused, the seed pearls her maid pressed upon her before every engagement, because ornament on a tenant read, to her own private ear if no one else's, as a kind of lie, and she watched the room glitter around her the way one watches a fire through a window, warmed by it and excluded from it in the very same instant. It was Lady Seraphina Vale who delivered the blow. And delivered it, as she delivered every cruelty, with a smile so perfectly calibrated that half the room would later swear no unkindness had been intended at all. Seraphina was everything the ballroom adored, and Eleanor was not, golden-haired, quick-tongued, dressed in a shade of rose that made every other woman in the room look faintly apologetic by comparison, and possessed of a wit sharp enough to draw blood so cleanly that her victims often did not notice the wound until the laughter around them made it undeniable. She crossed the floor toward Eleanor with two other ladies in her wake, the three of them moving with the loose, confident grace of women who had never once in their lives paid for the privilege of a roof. And she paused before Eleanor with her fan half raised, her eyes bright with a friendliness that did not reach them. "My dear Duchess," she said, and the title in her mouth was its own small violence. "How clever you are to manage such a splendid evening on so very careful a budget. One does hear things, of course, about the rent, and so on. It cannot be easy, being made to pay for the privilege of one's own drawing room. I do think it shows such remarkable fortitude." The words sounded like praise. The pressure beneath them was not. Eleanor felt the room's attention gather, subtly, the way a crowd gathers around a spill before anyone has quite decided to look, and she understood, in the half-second before she spoke, that a dozen conversations nearby had thinned to listening silence, that Lady Augusta Penrose, the Duke's aunt, had turned her head with the unhurried interest of a woman who collected other people's humiliations the way some collect porcelain, and that whatever she said next would travel through the ballroom and out into the wider season faster than any invitation ever had. She could have said a great many things. She could have observed that fortitude was easier to admire in another woman than to practice oneself. She could have asked whether Lady Seraphina's own father's debts, which were the subject of considerable and less discreet gossip that very season, were paid with quite such fortitude. She could have said nothing at all, and let the silence do the work of contempt. She did none of these. Instead, she smiled, the small, contained smile she had practiced until it cost her nothing visible, and said that she was grateful for the observation, that a woman who understood the value of a shilling was perhaps better placed than most to ensure that an evening's ices did not run short before the dancing ended, and that she hoped Lady Seraphina had found the champagne to her satisfaction, since she had chosen it herself with rather less budget than the label suggested. It was not an insult. It could not be called one by anyone repeating it afterward, but it relocated, with surgical precision, the entire weight of the exchange, reminding the listening room that the splendid evening they were all presently enjoying had been assembled, ice and champagne and orchestra alike, by the very woman being mocked for the smallness of her means, and the laughter that followed, when it came, was not universal, but it was enough. A ripple of amusement at Seraphina's expense that made her color rise beneath her powder before she recovered herself with a brittle little laugh of her own and swept away toward easier company. It was not a victory. Eleanor did not permit herself to feel it as one. But it was, she thought, watching Serafina's rose silk vanish into the crowd, a very small repayment on a debt that had been accruing for 3 years, and she allowed herself exactly that much satisfaction before folding it away, the way she folded everything, and returning her attention to the orchestra, the ices. The small, unglamorous machinery of an evening no one would ever credit her for running. It was some 20 minutes later, retreating toward the library to fetch a fresh set of cards for the whist tables before the housekeeper could be troubled to send a footman, that she heard the voice she had least expected and most dreaded. Low, unhurried, and utterly without the performance he reserved for company, coming from behind a door left carelessly ajar. Julian was speaking with his aunt, Lady Augusta Penrose, in tones neither of them imagined carried, and Eleanor, halfway across the threshold with her hand already lifted to push the door wider, stopped as though the floor itself had seized her feet. "She is managing the evening admirably," Augusta was saying, in the voice of a woman offering a compliment she did not entirely believe the recipient deserved. One might almost forget she was not bred to it. And Julian's reply, when it came, arrived in the flat-contained register he used for figures and for weather, and, apparently, for his own wife. "She was not bred to it," he said, "and I have no intention of pretending otherwise, to her or to anyone else. She is not my wife in the ways that matter, Augusta. She is a tenant who happens to share my name, and I will not let her mistake payment for belonging. It is kinder, in the end, to be honest about the nature of an arrangement than to let her build a life on a misunderstanding I never intended to correct." Eleanor did not move. She did not make a sound. She stood in the doorway with the cards forgotten in her hand and listened to her husband describe, in the same voice he might use to correct an error in a rent roll, the precise dimensions of her own irrelevance, and something in her chest performed the strange, silent collapse of a structure that has been quietly failing for a long time before it finally, definitively, gives way. She withdrew before either of them could turn and find her there, retreating down the corridor with the cards still clutched in one hand, her steps neither hurried nor unsteady, because even now, even with the words still ringing in the private chamber of her skull where no one else could hear them, she would not permit her body to announce what her heart had just absorbed. There was no scene. She did not weep in the corridor, or drop the cards, or flee to her room to sob into a pillow, the way a lesser telling of this story might have required. She delivered the cards to the whist tables. She smiled at Lady Fenwick, who complimented the ices. She stood beside her husband for the final quarter hour of the evening, near enough that observers would have called the marriage a picture of contented alliance, far enough that his sleeve never once brushed hers, and when the last guests had gone and the candles had begun to gutter in their sockets, she climbed the stairs to her own room, in her own house that was legally more hers than his, and sat for a long while with the tin box open in her lap, turning the silver thimble over between her fingers, saying nothing to the empty room, because there was, after 3 years, no one left to say it to. The music began again below her window an hour later, some late group of departing guests singing snatches of a song in the square, laughter carrying up through the glass, the world entirely unmoved by the small private death that had just occurred 2 floors above it. No thunder gathered, no curtain fell. The city simply continued, as cities and households and marriages of convenience all continue, indifferent to the exact moment a woman decides, quietly and without ceremony, that she will no longer expect to be seen. It was this decision, more than any single cruelty that had produced it, which altered the year that followed, though neither Eleanor nor the man who had provoked it could have named the change at the time. She did not become colder. She did not withhold her competence from the house that so thoroughly failed to credit it. But something in her bearing shifted. Subtly, the way a tide shifts before anyone standing on the shore can say precisely when it turned, and it was this new quality, this dignity that had stopped waiting for permission to exist, that Julian Ashbourne began, against every intention he had ever formed, to notice. The first occasion he could not later account for, even to himself, was a Tuesday some 3 weeks after the ball, when a tenant dispute arrived at Rothmere Hall in the shape of an aggrieved farmer named Coombs, convinced that his rent had been miscalculated against him, arriving red-faced and furious at the estate office door with a fistful of receipts and no patience left for the steward's careful, plodding explanations. Julian, summoned from his study by the noise, arrived at the office threshold expecting to intervene in a shouting match, and found instead his own wife seated calmly behind the desk, Coombs's receipts spread before her in a fan of careful order, walking the man through each figure in a voice so patient and so precisely reasoned that the anger had drained visibly from his shoulders by the third sentence. She found the error within minutes, a miscalculation from the previous steward's tenure that had in fact been quietly overcharging Coombs for 2 years running, and rather than defend the estate's prior mistake, she apologized for it plainly, informed the farmer of the sum owed to him in restitution, and had Mr. Wren draw the payment before the man left the room, so that Coombs departed not merely satisfied, but faintly awed, tipping his hat to her with a respect Julian had rarely seen extended to anyone beneath a title, let alone to a woman he had arrived prepared to distrust. Julian said nothing. He had not, in fact, made his presence known at all, retreating from the doorway before either his wife or the departing farmer could notice him there, and he told himself, climbing the stairs back to his study, that the incident was unremarkable, that any competent steward's wife might have managed as much, that it signified nothing beyond a household running as households were meant to run. But he found, over the following days, that his mind returned to the scene with an insistence he could not entirely suppress, to the particular steadiness of her hands over the receipts, to the fact that she had corrected an error against her own house's interest, without a flicker of the hesitation he might have expected from a woman whose every allowance he had, by his own design, made contingent and precarious. It was not admiration. Not yet. But it was recognition, unwelcome and unbidden, of a kind of worth he had spent 3 years training himself not to look for. He began, without quite admitting the habit to himself, to watch her more closely at the events she arranged, to notice the particular economy with which she solved problems no one else in the house had even identified as problems, the way she managed his aunt's difficult moods and his tenants' small grievances and his own mother's increasingly pointed questions about the state of the succession. With an identical, unhurried grace that asked for nothing in return. He noticed, too, though he resisted the noticing longest of all, that she never once, in all these small competencies, sought his praise for them, that she performed them the way a woman performs a private devotion, expecting no congregation and requiring none. It disturbed him more than any complaint could have. A wife who managed his house well while resenting him loudly would have confirmed everything he had built the marriage to withstand. A wife who managed his house brilliantly while asking nothing of him at all suggested, with each passing week, that the architecture of distance he had constructed so carefully might have been built on a foundation of his own error rather than her deficiency. And Julian Ashbourne, Duke of Rothmere, was not a man accustomed to discovering his own errors, least of all in a domain he had considered thoroughly settled since the day of his wedding. It was his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Cornelia, arriving at Rothmere Hall for an extended stay that same autumn, who first named aloud what Julian would not yet permit himself to think. She was a formidable woman of 71 years, given to blunt speech and tartar observations than her age was generally supposed to license, and she had disliked the marriage's transactional character from its inception, though she had said little of it while the old duke's debts still hung over the family like weather. Watching Eleanor manage a difficult dinner for a visiting bishop with a composure that would have done credit to a woman twice her experience, Cornelia turned to her grandson over the port and remarked, without any preamble at all, that she had rarely seen a woman so thoroughly capable of running a great house made to feel so thoroughly unwelcome within it. Julian replied that Eleanor wanted for nothing at Rothmere. His grandmother's laugh was short and entirely without humor. Wanting for nothing and being wanted are not the same arithmetic, Julian, she said, and I begin to suspect you have confused the two on purpose, because the second sum frightens you rather more than the first. He did not answer her. There was, in truth, no answer he was prepared to give, and his grandmother, watching him retreat behind his glass of port with the particular stillness he had perfected since his father's death, understood that she had planted something she would not see grow for some while yet, and contented herself, for the present, with believing Eleanor's quiet worth long before she had troubled herself to gather any evidence for it beyond the plain fact of the girl's bearing, which was, Cornelia often said afterward, evidence enough for anyone with eyes. It was around this same time that Eleanor found, unexpectedly, an ally in Harriet, Lady Fenwick, a widow of considerable means and considerably less patience for society's pretensions, who had taken a liking to Eleanor at that first disastrous ball and had cultivated the friendship since with a warmth Eleanor had not permitted herself to expect from anyone in that glittering world. It was Harriet who, over tea one gray afternoon in October, set down her cup with a decisive click and observed, in the teasing but entirely serious voice she reserved for truths no one else would speak, that she had watched the Duke watch his wife across 3 separate rooms in as many weeks, and that a man did not develop so sudden an interest in the placement of his wife's chair. The temperature of his wife's tea, the particular angle of light falling across his wife's face during dinner, unless something in him had begun, however unwillingly, to notice a woman he had spent considerable effort teaching himself not to see. Eleanor had laughed the observation off, a small dry laugh entirely without conviction, and said that her husband noticed the accounts, and the tenants, and the correct running of his house, and nothing beyond these, because he had told her as much himself, in his own words, through a door he had not known was open. Harriet had studied her for a long moment after that, her teasing warmth cooling into something graver, and said only that doors left ajar told a person what was said in a given hour, but not necessarily what was true across a lifetime, and that Eleanor, of all women she knew, ought to understand better than most the difference between an official ledger and the truth beneath it. Before rising, gathering her gloves, and taking her leave with the observation left hanging in the room like a held breath, one Eleanor found herself, against her own careful discipline, unable to entirely release. The quarter turned. Winter arrived at Rothmere Hall in its usual grim ceremony, frost silvering the long windows, the household accounts requiring their usual quiet attention, and the rent invoice arrived once more upon Eleanor's breakfast plate, folded into her napkin exactly as it always was, the sum unchanged, the signature unchanged, the single word at the bottom unchanged. She paid it, as she always paid it, to the penny, and said nothing, because saying something had never yet altered the arithmetic of the arrangement, and she saw no reason to believe this quarter would prove the exception. But she noticed, this time, folding the receipt into the small tin box beside her mother's thimble, that her husband's eyes had lingered on her a moment longer than they generally did across the breakfast table before he returned, with visible effort to his correspondence, and she noticed, too, though she would not have admitted to noticing it, that some small, stubborn part of her chest had lifted at the observation before she could discipline it back into its proper stillness. A stitch nobody sees still holds the whole seam, she reminded herself, closing the lid, and told herself that whatever her husband was beginning to notice, she required no audience to continue the quiet, uncredited work of being exactly what she had always been. Whether or not the house he had built around her ever thought to call it worth. The winter deepened at Rothmere Hall in the particular way that country winters deepen when a house is old enough to remember worse ones, frost climbing the library windows in slow feathered patterns. The fires kept burning from dawn until well past midnight, and it was into this season of long enclosed evenings that the slow, reluctant thaw between Eleanor and her husband continued, inch by inch, disguised as nothing more than the ordinary business of a well-run household. He had taken, without ever announcing the habit, to appearing in the estate office some mornings when the tenant accounts were reconciled, standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back as though he had wandered in by accident and merely stayed out of idle curiosity, and Eleanor had learned to read in the particular quality of his silence. A kind of attention he would have denied giving had she been indelicate enough to name it. "Your figures are always correct," he observed one such morning, watching her close the ledger on the tenant rolls with the brisk finality of a woman who did not require a witness to know her work was sound. It was the closest he had come, in 3 years, to a compliment, and Eleanor, without lifting her eyes from the desk, replied that a woman raised to balance her father's mill accounts before she could reach the top shelf of his study had very little choice but to be correct, since her father had never once forgiven an error twice. It was not an invitation to further conversation. It was, if anything, a small closed door, and Julian, recognizing it as such, said nothing further, though he did not immediately leave the room either, and Eleanor was left to note, with the wary interior stillness of a woman unwilling to hope for anything she could not afford to lose, that her husband had begun lingering in doorways he had no obvious business occupying. The duels, when they came, had grown subtler than Lady Seraphina's opening salvo at the ball, sharpened now by an audience that had begun, in its idle way, to notice the Duke's attention drifting toward his own wife with a frequency society found faintly scandalous in a marriage everyone had long ago filed away as a settled and loveless arrangement. It was Lady Augusta Penrose who pressed hardest, arriving at Rothmere for the Christmas season with her son Reginald in tow. A young man of expensive tastes and indifferent prospects, whom Eleanor had met perhaps a dozen times without ever once feeling she had truly seen him, and it was Augusta who remarked, over a dinner table glittering with the season's borrowed cheer, that she did hope the Duchess was not finding the house's economies too burdensome this year, what with coal so dear, and rents, of course, being rents. The words sounded like solicitude. The pressure beneath them was not, and Eleanor understood, from the small, bright interest in Augusta's eyes, that the older woman had chosen the word rent deliberately. The way one presses a bruise to confirm it is still tender. She replied, with the same unhurried courtesy she had spent years perfecting, that she found nothing burdensome in economy, since a house run honestly never need fear an accounting, and she hoped Mr. Reginald's own expenses this season had proven equally easy to reconcile. It was not an accusation. It could not be repeated as one. But Reginald's color rose faintly at the remark, and Augusta's smile thinned by the smallest fraction, and Julian, seated at the head of the table, watched the entire exchange with an expression Eleanor could not read, though she noted, with the private satisfaction she allowed herself only in memory, that he had not once come to Augusta's defense. It was cousin Agnes Coyle who arrived a week later, uninvited but never quite turned away, a widow of modest means and considerable appetite for the comforts Eleanor's marriage afforded her by association, and who settled into the blue guest room with the easy, proprietary air of a woman who had long ago decided that Eleanor's good fortune existed chiefly to be shared. She meant no unkindness, or so she always insisted, and her affection for Eleanor was, in its way, entirely genuine, but it arrived wrapped so thoroughly in expectation that Eleanor had learned to receive it the way one receives a gift with a hook concealed beneath the ribbon. "You mustn't make a fuss about the rent business, darling," Agnes said one evening, settling herself before the fire with the particular comfort of a woman who had never once paid for the coal that warmed her. "It's only His Grace's way, and a wife who complains of her husband's economies is a wife who invites talk. And we cannot afford talk, can we? Not with your poor father's memory to consider, and not with dear Bertram's situation being what it is this year." Eleanor understood the shape of the sentence before Agnes had finished it. Dear Bertram's situation, a euphemism for her cousin's gambling debts, was precisely the sort of family burden that required Eleanor's continued good standing, and, more pointedly, her continued silence, since a duchess who caused scandal was a duchess whose relations could no longer count on her quiet, occasional generosity to smooth their difficulties. She said only that she had no intention of making a fuss, and that Agnes need not trouble herself over talk that had not yet occurred, and Agnes, satisfied, returned to her tea, entirely unaware that she had just asked Eleanor, in the gentlest possible language, to continue absorbing an injustice for the family's convenience, precisely as she had absorbed it for 3 years already. It was against this quietly accumulating pressure, family on one side demanding her silence and society on the other delighting in her humiliation, that the notice from her husband continued its slow, wary bloom. And it was perhaps 3 weeks into the new year, on an evening when a sudden ice storm had confined the household to the fires and the candlelight of the long gallery, that Julian said something that startled them both. They had been discussing, of all unlikely subjects, the tenant Coombs's harvest, a subject Eleanor had raised only to fill a silence that had grown, over the preceding half-hour, oddly companionable rather than merely tense, and Julian, watching her describe the man's stubborn insistence on repaying the restitution she had arranged for him in installments he could ill afford, said, quietly, that he did not know many women who would have troubled themselves to correct an error that cost the estate money rather than saved it. "I did not marry a woman who required correcting," Eleanor said, before she could entirely govern the words, "only a house that required managing, and I have managed it." It was the closest she had come, in 3 years, to naming the wound aloud, and she saw it land, saw something flicker and still in her husband's face before he mastered it, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow he had, by his own hand, thoroughly earned. He did not apologize. He was not, she had learned, a man who apologized easily, or perhaps at all, but he said, after a long moment, that he had perhaps mistaken the nature of what he had purchased when he married her, and that the mistake, if it was one, had not been hers, and Eleanor, hearing in this the closest thing to an admission she had yet been offered, found she did not trust it enough to answer, and so she said nothing, and the silence that followed was not, for the first time in a long while, entirely uncomfortable. It was into this fragile, unnamed thaw that the letter arrived, some 10 days later. And it arrived not folded discreetly into a napkin, but delivered directly into the hands of Mr. Holloway, the family solicitor, who brought it to Rothmere Hall himself rather than trust it to the post, his face carrying the particular gray solemnity of a man bearing news he wished profoundly to be spared delivering. The letter was unsigned. It was addressed to the trustees of the Rothmere estate, the same body of men who oversaw the terms of the marriage settlement negotiated between Josiah Hartley and the late Duke a decade before, and it alleged, in careful, damning detail, that the current Duchess of Rothmere had, over a period of some 18 months, systematically diverted funds from the estate's tenant accounts into the keeping of her own relations, chiefly one Mrs. Agnes Coyle and one Mr. Bertram Hartley, using her privileged access to the household ledgers to disguise the transfers as legitimate expenses. Enclosed with the letter, folded inside a second sheet, was a page purporting to be torn from the estate's own account book, in a hand very nearly identical to Eleanor's careful script, recording a payment of £40 to Mrs. Coyle disguised under the heading of household linens, dated some 3 months prior. The accusation, if believed, threatened considerably more than embarrassment. The marriage settlement itself contained a clause, inserted at the old Duke's insistence during the original negotiations, permitting the trustees to void the settlement's more generous provisions should either party be found to have defrauded the estate, a clause that had seemed, at the time, a mere formality demanded by lawyers who trusted no one, and which now stood revealed as a blade quietly sharpened and left waiting. Should the trustees find the allegation credible, Eleanor stood to lose not merely her standing and her reputation, but the settled income her father had fought to secure her, the very foundation beneath the fragile independence she had spent 3 years quietly, uncreditedly, protecting. And Julian, reading the letter in his study with Mr. Holloway standing gravely before him, felt the old architecture of his own suspicion, the one he had spent recent weeks dismantling by such slow and unwilling degrees, threatened to rebuild itself in an instant. He summoned Eleanor to the study within the hour. She came without knowing why, still in her morning gown, her hands faintly stained with ink from the tenant ledgers she had been reconciling not 20 minutes before, and she read the letter twice, standing before her husband's desk, while he watched her with an expression she could not decode, and did not, in that moment, have the composure to attempt. "Is it true?" he asked, and his voice carried none of the warmth of the ice storm evening, only the flat, careful register of a man testing a hypothesis he dreaded confirming. Eleanor felt the question land somewhere beneath her ribs, a wound sharper than any Seraphina's fan had ever delivered, because this one arrived not from a stranger in a ballroom, but from the man whose slow, grudging notice she had, against every discipline she owned, begun to permit herself to want. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. She said only that she had never in her life taken a shilling that was not owed her, and that if her husband required proof beyond 3 years of ledgers kept in her own hand, she did not know what proof she could offer that would satisfy a man already prepared to believe the worst of her, and she turned and left the study before he could answer, because there are moments, she had learned, when dignity requires departure rather than defense. It was the Dowager Duchess Cornelia who intervened before the wound could fester further, summoned by Mr. Holloway's grave face, and arriving in the study within the hour to find her grandson staring at the forged ledger page as though it might, given sufficient scrutiny, rearrange itself into something less damning. "I have known that girl for a year and a half," Cornelia said, without preamble, settling herself into the chair before his desk with the particular authority of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her own doubts, "and I have watched her save this family more shillings than your father wasted in a decade of bad harvests, and I will not sit in this house and hear her doubted on the strength of an unsigned letter and a torn page that any competent forger could produce for the price of good paper." She believed Eleanor's innocence, she informed her grandson, entirely and immediately, and she required no evidence to do so beyond the plain fact of the girl's bearing across 18 months of quiet, uncredited labor. Though she would, she added dryly, be very glad to gather evidence regardless, since a belief unaccompanied by proof persuaded no one but the already convinced. It was Cornelia, in the end, who insisted the forged page be examined properly, summoning Mr. Wren the steward and Mr. Holloway both to the estate office, with every ledger, receipt book, and stationer's bill the household possessed. And it was Eleanor herself, once her private wound had cooled enough to permit her hands to be useful again, who conducted the examination with the same unhurried precision she brought to every column of figures she had ever balanced. She laid the forged page beside the genuine ledger and studied both beneath the strongest lamp in the office, and it was Mr. Wren who noticed first, murmuring that the paper itself seemed of a heavier stock than the household generally purchased. But it was Eleanor who found the anomaly that mattered, turning to the stationer's own delivery bills from the preceding year and tracing, with a finger that did not tremble, the exact date the current receipt book. The one whose serial-numbered pages matched every genuine entry in the estate's true accounts had first arrived at Rothmere Hall from the stationer in London. The forged page claimed a transaction dated the 14th of September. The receipt book from which the page had ostensibly been torn, according to the stationer's own delivery record, signed and dated by Mr. Wren himself upon its arrival, had not reached Rothmere Hall until the 2nd of October. There it is, Eleanor said quietly, setting the two documents side by side beneath the lamp so that even Julian, summoned back to the office at his grandmother's insistence, could see the impossibility laid bare in black ink. Whoever wrote this page did not trouble to check when the paper they forged it upon had actually come into the house, she said, and a woman who had truly diverted funds across 18 months would hardly need to forge evidence of the theft on paper that did not yet exist to commit it. The room absorbed the fact in silence. Mr. Holloway examined the dates twice more, murmuring his agreement. Cornelia's expression carried the particular satisfaction of a woman whose faith had just been vindicated by evidence she had never actually required, and Julian, staring at the two documents laid side by side, felt something in his own chest that he would later be unable to name precisely, though it resembled shame considerably more than relief. There was, beyond the impossible date, a second anomaly Eleanor pointed out with the same flat, unemotional precision, drawing her husband's attention to the figure 7 as it appeared throughout the genuine ledger, crossed always with the small continental stroke her father's ironworks clerks had taught her as a girl, a habit so ingrained she had never once thought to disguise or explain it. And comparing it against the 7s in the forged entry, written plainly, without the stroke, by a hand that had clearly studied her looping script closely enough to mimic its general shape, while missing the one detail too small and too habitual for a casual observer to notice or reproduce. Someone who knows my hand well enough to imitate the shape of my letters, she said, but not well enough to have watched me write 100 columns of figures at this desk, which narrows the field considerably from the whole of London. It was Mr. Wren, pressed gently by the Dowager Duchess, and rather less gently by Mr. Holloway, who at last admitted, with visible reluctance, that he had some weeks prior noticed irregularities in the allowance drawn against young Mr. Reginald Penrose's account, sums exceeding what his mother had authorized, and that he had mentioned the discrepancy to Lady Augusta directly rather than troubling his grace with what he had assumed, at the time, was a simple clerical confusion. The picture assembled itself with the grim, unhurried inevitability of a debt finally called. Reginald Penrose, drowning in gambling obligations he dared not confess to his mother, had been quietly bleeding his own allowance dry for months, and Augusta, discovering the shortfall and unwilling to see her son's name attached to scandal, had seized upon the household's careful new scrutiny, the very scrutiny Eleanor's competence had introduced, as a threat requiring preemption. and had constructed, with whatever assistance her own bitterness and Lady Seraphina's willing malice could supply, an accusation designed to destroy the one woman capable of discovering the truth before either mother or son could conceal it. Confronted in the drawing room that same evening, with Cornelia present as an unblinking witness and Julian's face set in an expression of controlled and terrible calm, Augusta did not confess so much as collapse into a long, bitter justification, insisting she had only meant to protect her son from a debtor's prison her husband's memory could not have survived. That the letter had been Seraphina's suggestion more than her own, that she had never imagined the falsehood would be examined so closely or so quickly, and that a woman in her position, widowed and dependent on Rothmir's continued goodwill, had very few other means of shielding a child from ruin. Julian listened to the whole of it without once raising his voice, and told his aunt, in the same flat register he had used to doubt his own wife not 4 hours before, that she would leave Rothmere Hall within the week, that Reginald's debts would be settled quietly and privately on the strict condition that the young man take a position abroad, managing a distant cousin's shipping concerns until he had learned the difference between an allowance and an entitlement, and that the matter would never be spoken of again within these walls, though he could not, he added, answer for what was said beyond them. It was, Eleanor thought, watching her husband deliver this judgment with the same controlled precision he brought to every ledger and every rent invoice, the most she had ever heard him speak in defense of anyone, and she noted, with an ache she could not entirely place, that the defense had arrived only after the accusation had already cost her an hour of believing herself doubted by the one person whose doubt could wound her most. He did not seek her out again that evening, and she did not seek him, each retreating to the separate, careful distances that had governed the marriage for 3 years, though the distance now carried a different quality, charged rather than merely cold, the silence of two people who had both glimpsed, in the space of a single, terrible afternoon, exactly how much the other's good opinion had come to matter without either having agreed, aloud, that it should. It was 2 nights later, with the ice storm that had confined the household to its fires finally breaking into something fiercer, sleet driving hard against the long gallery windows, and the wind finding every loose casement in the old house to moan through, that a footman came to Eleanor's room a little before midnight bearing a message from His Grace, requesting, in words too formal to disguise the tension beneath them, that the Duchess join him in the library, alone, at her earliest convenience. She sat for a long moment after the footman withdrew, the tin box open in her lap, as it so often was in moments requiring more courage than comfort, the silver thimble cool against her palm, her mother's voice moving once more through the worn corridors of memory. A stitch nobody sees still holds the whole seam. Eleanor, so anyway. She closed the box, rose, and made her way down the darkened gallery toward the library, where a single lamp burned against the storm-lashed windows, and her husband stood waiting, his back to the door, his shoulders carrying a stillness she had learned, across 3 long years, to recognize as the particular stillness of a man about to say something he had spent a very long time refusing to allow himself to feel. He turned before she had crossed half the length of the library, and the lamp behind him threw his shadow long across the carpet, and Eleanor stopped just inside the door, because something in the set of his shoulders told her that whatever waited in this room tonight would not be conducted from behind a desk. The storm found every loose pane in the old house and rattled it. A low, continuous percussion beneath the silence, and Julian crossed the first stretch of floor between them slowly, the way a man crosses ice he does not entirely trust, stopping still some 6 feet from where she stood, with her hand resting, out of long habit, against the doorframe as though prepared to retreat through it. "I have spent this evening composing several versions of what I meant to say to you," he began, and his voice carried none of the flat, ledger-cool register she had learned to expect from him across 3 years of marriage, and every version began with an apology for the study, for the letter, for the moment I asked whether you had lied to me before I had troubled to ask whether I had ever given you reason to trust that I would believe you. He crossed another stretch of floor, narrower this time, close enough now that the lamplight caught the strain in his face plainly. "I am not going to apologize first," he said, "because an apology offered before the truth is only a way of hurrying past it, and I find I no longer wish to hurry past anything where you are concerned." Eleanor did not move from the doorframe. 3 years had taught her the cost of surrendering too quickly to a kindness that might, come morning, reveal itself as merely another mood. And she said, in a voice that cost her considerably more composure than it displayed, that she required more from him than a well-composed evening, that a woman could not be expected to warm herself at a fire that had spent 3 winters insisting it did not burn for her. "It was not I who told your aunt I mistook payment for belonging," she said. "It was not I who wrote the word tenant at the bottom of an invoice as though it were a title I had earned. If you have come tonight to unsay 3 years in a single evening, your grace, I do not know that I trust the arithmetic." The word tenant, spoken aloud between them for the first time by her own mouth rather than folded silently into a napkin, seemed to strike him harder than any accusation could have. And he closed the last of the distance between them, not with the sudden motion of a man overcome, but with the same measured, deliberate steps he had used to cross the whole room, as though he understood, without being told, that whatever trust remained to be rebuilt would have to be built at exactly this pace and no faster. "I did not marry you because I wished to," he said. And the words arrived plainly, without softening, because he had never been a man who dressed a hard truth in kinder clothes. "I did not learn to value you because I chose to look for reasons. I did not begin watching you across every room in this house because I decided one morning that it was safe to feel something for a woman I had spent 3 years training myself not to see. Every ledger you corrected without asking my thanks, every tenant you defended against my own family's cruelty, every evening you managed while I stood at the edge of it pretending indifference, taught me something I did not want to learn and could not, in the end, refuse to know." His voice, by the 3rd clause, had shed every trace of the authority he wore like armor before his household and his peers, until what remained was simply a man standing too close to a woman he had wronged, offering the plainest accounting he had ever given anyone. "I did not come to this room tonight because the trustees require an answer about my aunt's disgrace," he said. "I did not come because a duke, without a settled marriage, invites talk more dangerous than any forged letter Augusta ever produced. I did not come because it would be convenient, or expected, or easy to make peace with you before the whole affair becomes the season's favorite story. I came because I could not spend one more night in this house pretending I had not begun to wait for the sound of your step in the corridor, and because I would rather be the man who told you that plainly and be refused than continue being the man who let you believe, even for one more quarter, that you were only ever a tenant here." Eleanor felt the words land somewhere beneath the careful architecture of her own restraint, felt the old wound and the new tenderness arrive in the same breath, indistinguishable from one another for one long, dangerous moment, and she did not surrender to it. Not yet, because 3 years of paying to the penny for a place she had never truly been given had taught her that a debt of feeling, too, deserved to be honored in full rather than forgiven on credit. "I believe you," she said quietly, and it was not admiration, not yet, But something steadier, recognition long delayed, finally permitted to arrive. And I am glad, more glad than I know how to say plainly, that you have come to it. But I will not pretend 3 years away, because one storm has finally loosened your tongue, Julian. I have been patient because patience was the only power available to a woman in my position, and I will not now mistake a single confession, however sincerely offered, for the whole of what I am owed. If you wish to be believed, you will have to be present for the believing, quarter after quarter, the way I was present for the rent. It was, she thought even as she said it, the truest thing she had told him in 3 years, and she watched it land on him not as a rebuke, but as something closer to relief. The relief of a man discovering that the woman he had finally chosen to see was, in fact, exactly as formidable as he had begun, too late to suspect. He did not reach for her. He asked instead, in a voice gone rough at the edges, whether she would permit him to earn that presence, 1 quarter at a time if that was what honesty required, and Eleanor, feeling something in her chest loosen that had been clenched since the morning of the very first invoice, said that she would, and that she expected him to begin plainly. Tonight, by telling her why. Of all the reasons a man might offer for wanting a wife's forgiveness, he believed his own worth trusting. Not because the estate requires an heir, he said, and it was the first of the 3, offered low and even. Not because society would forgive a duke his cruelty faster than it would forgive a duchess her silence. Not because my grandmother has made her opinion of my conduct considerably plainer than I would like. I want you, Eleanor, because in 3 years of watching you manage a house that gave you nothing in return, I have never once seen you perform your worth for an audience. You do the same careful, unwitnessed work whether I am standing in the doorway or 1,000 miles away, and I find, to my own considerable surprise, that I no longer wish to be a man you have to manage in my absence. I wish to be a man you would still choose in a room with the door closed and no one left to see it. It was the truest reason he had ever given her for anything, wanted when no one is watching, and Eleanor, hearing it, felt the last of her guarded distance give way not in a rush, but the way a held breath finally releases, and she crossed, herself now, the final small distance between them, and said, so quietly the storm nearly swallowed it, yes, because I wish it. And it was answer enough. Offered not as surrender, but as a debt finally, mutually, settled, he took her hand then. The one that had signed 3 years of rent receipts and reconciled 3 years of another family's careless arithmetic. And he did not let it go. Not when she drew a breath that broke, at last, into the single dignified sob she had been withholding since the morning of that first cold invoice. A sound that arrived not as collapse, but as truth, simply reaching the surface after years spent beneath it. And he stood there, holding her hand through the whole of it, saying nothing further because nothing further was required, until the storm outside had softened into a steadier rain, and the fire behind them burned low, and when at last she lifted her head he had still not released her hand. And did not release it as they left the library together, and did not release it, in fact, for a long while afterward, so that the servants who passed them in the gallery the following morning would remark to one another, in the particular hushed astonishment reserved for household news too large to hold, that His Grace had been seen walking the length of the east wing with the Duchess's hand, still folded in his own, as though he had forgotten, or perhaps simply refused to let it go. The winter thawed into a spring that arrived, that year, with unusual generosity, and the household at Rothmere Hall settled into a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Julian had thought to expect from a marriage that had spent 3 years defined by distance. A rhythm built not on grand declarations, but on the same quiet accumulation of small, correct things that had always been Eleanor's particular gift, applied now to a marriage rather than merely a ledger. The rent invoice did not arrive again. Julian tore the standing order from his own steward's hands the week following the storm and burned it in the library grate himself, informing Mr. Wren, in a tone that brooked no further clerking on the matter, that the Duchess of Rothmere was mistress of that house by right and not by lease, and would remain so for as long as the house itself stood. What Eleanor asked for in its place, when he pressed her, gently, to name some restitution for 3 years of an arrangement he now recognized as cruelty dressed as economy, was not jewels, nor an increased allowance, nor any of the ornaments Lady Seraphina had once mocked her for refusing, but a school, modest in scale and generous in purpose, to be built on Rothmere land for the tenant children who had, until now, learned their letters or did not learn them at all, according to the uneven charity of whichever farmwife had the patience to teach them, and a reformed rent structure for the tenants themselves, indexed honestly to the harvest rather than fixed by a landlord's convenience, the very reform she had spent 3 quiet years advocating in memoranda Julian had, in his earlier blindness, barely troubled to read. He gave her both, and more besides, and it was the school, more than any grander gesture, that became the visible proof to the wider county of a marriage transformed, though the county itself would take rather longer than the household to notice the change, since society, Eleanor had learned, forgave a story only once it had been permitted a sufficiently public occasion to do so. That occasion arrived some 18 months later, on a bright autumn morning when the Rothmere tenants and half the county besides gathered on the green before the newly finished schoolhouse for its formal opening, a modest stone building with wide windows, and a bell that had been cast, at Eleanor's particular insistence, from the melted-down silver of an old, unused set of ceremonial plate that had sat gathering dust in the Rothmere strong-room. Since before her marriage, on the grounds, she had said dryly that unused silver ought to be made useful to someone. The green was crowded with tenant families in their good but modest clothes, with the Dowager Duchess Cornelia installed in a chair of honor near the schoolhouse steps, her cane planted before her with the satisfaction of a woman who had believed in this outcome long before anyone had troubled to earn her certainty, with Harriet, Lady Fenwick, standing near the back with the particular fond, unsurprised smile of a woman who had told her friend, years before, exactly what she saw when she watched a certain duke watch his wife across a crowded room, and with a scattering of the county's more prominent families who had, in the 2 years since the scandal of the forged letter had broken and been resolved in Eleanor's unimpeachable favor, found it considerably more comfortable to remember themselves as having always suspected the Duchess's quiet excellence than to admit how thoroughly they had once overlooked it. Lady Seraphina Vale did not attend. Her own fortunes, never entirely separable from her Aunt Augusta's disgrace, had cooled considerably in the 2 intervening seasons, her wit no longer quite so charming once the county understood the uses to which it had once been put, and she had, by the time of the schoolhouse opening, married a baronet of modest means in a neighboring county and removed herself from Rothmere's orbit entirely, her name mentioned now only in the past tense, and mentioned rarely even then. It was Julian who climbed the schoolhouse steps to address the gathered crowd, and the green fell hushed in the particular way a crowd falls silent when it senses, correctly, that it is about to witness something it will repeat at dinner tables for a decade afterward. And he stood a moment before he spoke, his eyes finding Eleanor where she stood near the front of the assembly in a gown of soft blue, the first true color she had permitted herself in years, her mother's tin box as always, somewhere near at hand, though she no longer needed to carry it for courage the way she once had. "There are those among you," he began, and his voice carried clearly across the green, "who remember a season, not so very long ago, in which my household was the subject of considerable talk, Talk I did a great deal, in those years, to earn. I will not pretend the talk was unjust. I treated my own wife as a tenant in a house that was, by right and by law, rather more hers than mine, and I did so because I mistook distance for safety and coldness for strength, and I was wrong, in every particular, and I do not say so today to be forgiven for it. Since forgiveness is a gift she has already given me rather more generously than I deserved, but because I think this county owes her an accounting rather less honest than her own ledgers, and I intend, this morning, to render it. He paused, and the green held its breath, the particular collective stillness, the profile of every crowd that has gathered to watch a wrong finally righted in public. They said she brought nothing to this house but her father's money, he said, and they were wrong. They said a woman without inherited standing could not earn the respect this county reserves for its oldest names, and they were wrong. They said the Duchess of Rothmere was a convenience to be managed rather than a woman to be valued, and they, more than any of the rest, were wrong in every syllable, and I count myself first among the fools who believed it. Every tenant on this land who has slept easier this year for a fair rent owes that fairness to her ledgers and her patience, not to mine. Every child who will learn letters in this schoolhouse behind me owes that schooling to a woman who was herself once dismissed as beneath the notice of the very house she has spent years quietly saving. And every man or woman in this county who ever wondered what quiet, uncelebrated worth looks like need only have watched her, as I did, far too late and far too blindly, but watched her nonetheless, and learned, as I have learned, that the truest competence in any house is very often the kind no one thinks to applaud until it is nearly too late to matter. He looked out over the assembled crowd, tenants and gentry alike, and said that he hoped this schoolhouse might stand long after every one of them had gone to dust, teaching each new child who passed through its doors that worth was never a matter of birth or fortune, but of the quiet, patient, unglamorous work of doing right by the people who could not repay you for it. And that he could imagine no better legacy for his own house, nor any better mother for whatever children he and his wife might yet be given, than the woman who had taught him, at considerable cost to herself, exactly what that lesson meant. The applause that followed was not the qualified, uncertain laughter that had once greeted Lady Seraphina's cruelties in a London ballroom. It rose from the whole green at once, tenants and gentry together, genuine and unhesitating, the particular sound of a crowd correcting, in real time, an old collective error it had finally been given permission to name, and Eleanor, standing at the front of it, with her husband's public confession ringing across the green, felt the tears rise at last. Not the single controlled sob of the library, but something fuller now, permitted fully because the truth it answered had finally, properly, surfaced in the daylight rather than remaining folded away in a private room, and she did not hide this weeping, because there was, for the first time in years, nothing left to hide it from. Julian came down the schoolhouse steps and crossed the green toward her, the same measured distance he had crossed in the library that stormy night, and took her hand before the whole assembled county, and did not let it go, and the Dowager Duchess Cornelia, watching from her chair of honor, remarked to Harriet, in a voice not nearly as quiet as she perhaps intended, that she had told the boy as much a year and a half before he had thought to believe it, and that she expected now to be properly credited for her foresight at every family gathering for the remainder of her considerable life. It was that evening, the schoolhouse bell rung once in ceremony, and the tenant families dispersed back toward their own modest fires, that Eleanor sat with Julian on the low stone wall that bordered the green, the last of the autumn light draining gold across the fields her husband's family had held for 3 centuries, and her own quiet labor had finally made honest. And she took the tin box from her pocket, as she still did in moments that called for something steadier than words, and opened it to show him. For the first time in their marriage, the whole of what it held, the dented silver thimble, the unfinished strip of lace trailing off into its fringe of loose thread, and told him, in the plain, unadorned voice she used for truths that mattered most, what her mother had said to her once, kneeling on a cottage floor with a torn hem in her lap and no one to praise the mending. "A stitch nobody sees still holds the whole seam," she said. "So, anyway, I have sewn a great many unseen seams in this house, Julian, and I did not require your notice to keep doing it, but I will tell you plainly that I am glad, more glad than any ledger could record, that you have finally troubled to look." He took the thimble from her palm and turned it once in the fading light before pressing it back into her hand and closing her fingers over it, and said that he intended to spend whatever years remained to him proving that her mother's stitch had not gone unseen after all, that he had seen it, finally, and meant never again to look away from it, however long the seeing had taken him. She was always worth believing in, and the tragedy of those first 3 years was never that her worth had been in question, but that the house around her had simply refused, out of pride and habit and its own small cowardices, to look plainly at what had been in front of it all along. What came after was not perfect. The county still, on occasion, murmured of the scandal that had briefly threatened the Rothmere name, and Cousin Agnes Coyle still arrived from time to time, with a gentle and familiar appetite for the comforts Eleanor's position afforded, though Eleanor met these visits now with a settled patience that no longer cost her anything to maintain, since a woman certain of her own worth need not fear a relation uncertain of hers. Julian remained, in company, a man of few words and considerable reserve, dry where warmth was expected, and exacting where ease might have served him better, and there were evenings still when old habits of distance rose between them before either noticed enough to dissolve them. It was not perfect, and it was not always easy, but it was, in the end, simply shared, evenly and honestly, between two people who had each learned, by very different roads, what it cost to be truly seen. And that, Eleanor thought, watching the last of the storm clouds that had gathered again briefly over the western fields break apart at last into a clean and rain-washed dawn the following morning, was very considerably more than enough. She stood at the tall window of the room that had once felt, for 3 long years, like a lodging she merely rented rather than a home she owned, and watched the light climb gold over fields that were, at last and by every honest measure, entirely and mutually hers, and when Julian's hand found hers at the window, she did not withdraw it, and he did not let it go. And the two of them stood together in the clean, quiet light of that morning after the storm. Hands joined, facing forward into whatever the coming years intended to ask of them. Together,